Well, welcome to the 2020 CSG National Conference Reimagined. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being here. My name is Dina Klimkina, and I'm a program manager here at the Council of State Governments. And today's session is focused on inclusive legislatures, courts, and cabinets as part of CSG's focus on equity and inclusion. As a Ukrainian immigrant and program manager of our disability employment policy portfolio of work, equity and inclusion and diverse perspectives in public policy have always been critical to me personally. Diversity spurs innovation and creativity, improves the quality of discussion, and ensures high quality policy and programming outcomes that take a broader set of issues, perspectives, and unique standards into account. Diversity, equity, and inclusion of voices in public office can also lead to increased feelings of political efficacy amongst constituencies, heightened feelings of political representation, and participation. Currently, there are more than 1,300 state legislators of color in state legislatures. As of 2015, 18.1% of state legislators identified as a racial minority, while 81.7% of state legislatures nationwide identified as non-white Hispanics. Notably, statistics for 2020 state legislator demographics have not been compiled at the national level. However, state level trends seemingly indicate increased representation of racial minorities in state legislatures nationwide. So, for example, Nevada has doubled its number of legislators who identified as Hispanic or Latinx. However, other minority groups were represented approximately equally to 2020 compared to 2015. So, for example, Black legislators made up 5% of Kansas state legislature in both 2020 and 2015. And further, almost 88% of governors serving in 2019 were white. There's only one Black or African American governor, one Asian or Pacific American governor, two Hawaiian or Pacific Islander governors, and 3 Hispanic or Latinx governors. As of 2019, 140 state legislators and 105 state-level judicial officials have also identified as being part of the LGBTQ plus community, including 2 governors and 4 individuals of statewide executive offices. And in the 2020 election, 16 non-incumbent members of the LGBTQ plus community were elected to state legislatures nationwide. Yesterday, we saw President-elect Biden select Pete Buttigieg to become the first openly LGBTQ plus federal cabinet nominee in United States history. In 2020, there were also 90 women who held state elective offices across the country, roughly 28.9% of the 311 available positions. Of the 90 women, 16 or 17.8% were women of color. As you can see, the demographics of this country are changing. And as they change, it's important that legislators, executives, and members of the judicial branch reflect the diversity and wide-ranging constituencies they represent. However, there are often barriers to participation in politics, whether they're rooted in systemic issues, lack of participation due to feelings of low political efficacy, lack of engagement due to low representation by other individuals with similar backgrounds, or other psychological, physical, or structural barriers. Today, we will hear from a number of CSG members from across the United States. They'll share their stories, their backgrounds, and their pathways into their careers, and how they shape their approaches into policymaking. This session is in partnership with the Council on Communities of Color within CSG East. We are excited for an open and honest and respectful conversation about the inclusion of differing perspectives and identities that make public policy better for everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right, so before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items. So as far as accessibility, we do have closed captioning available, and you can use the link available on the screen or put in the chat. To reduce noise during the conversation, all participants will be muted during the webinar. And we also ask that you please turn off your camera so that there's no distractions. The webinar will be available to view on our website, and the transcripts and slides are also available in accessible PDF formats on the website you use to register. If you have any questions for our panelists or in general, please submit them through the chat feature, and we will make sure to ask them at the end of our conversation. If you have any technical difficulties or questions about Zoom, please use the chat feature to ask CSG registration or one of our staff. As we utilize the chat feature between participants and panelists, we ask to keep the chat on topic, and we also hope that you will cooperate in keeping the dialogue free from any solicitations or disruptive commentary. So without further delay, let's get started. Next slide, please. Today, I'm so excited to welcome our panelists, Justice Anne McKeag of Minnesota, Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick of Maryland, Brian Sims, Representative Brian Sims of Pennsylvania, Delegate Danica Rome of Virginia, and Representative Okimoto of Hawaii. I will do a brief bio for everyone. So first, Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick. She has served in the Maryland House of Delegates since 2007 and is currently the vice chair of the Health and Government Operations Committee. She's also the vice chair of the Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus, the chair of the Public Health and Minority Health Disparities Subcommittee of Health and Government Operations Committee, and serves on the Government Operations and Estates and Trust Subcommittee. She's very busy. She immigrated from the Dominican Republic to the United States as a child with her single mother and sister, and her mother worked in the New York garment industry. They often struggled to make ends meet, and despite the tough circumstances, she succeeded in school and learned English, and was an equal opportunity program scholar and the first in her family to attend college. She has worked across the country fighting for people on society's margins, including work on achieving basic living conditions, a safe work environment, and fair wages. Representative Sims is a distinguished policy attorney and civil rights advocate from the City Center of Philadelphia. He's the former staff counsel for policy and planning at the Philadelphia Bar Association, and recently stepped down as both the president of the board of directors of Equality Pennsylvania and as chairman of the Gay and Lesbian Lawyers of Philadelphia. During his time at the Bar Association, Sims worked with attorneys, legislators, and community organizations on issues ranging from gender and pay inequity to environmental regulation. A member of the National Campaign Board for Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund until 2011, he lectures regularly about the policy and legal challenges facing the LGBT civil rights movement, and is a regular lecturer at the Center for Progressive Leadership. He is the first out LGBT plus member of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Representative Val Okimoto was elected to the House of Representatives in Hawaii in 2018 and won re-election to her seat in November of this year. Congratulations. She earned her bachelor's in accounting with a minor in business management with honors from Brigham Young University of Hawaii, and obtained her special education certificate at Chaminade University in Honolulu. She was also a special education teacher in Hawaii Public Schools for 10 years. She's an active member of her community and serves as the director of the Town Association, a board member of her school community council, and president of a local chapter of women's organizations, among many other positions. She's a graduate of the CSG West Legislative Academy of 2019 and a recipient of the 2020 Women of Excellence Award. She's a mother of 2 beautiful daughters and is a strong advocate for family values, her community, and serving others. Next slide, please. Justice McKeag is joining us from Minnesota. She's the 94th Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court and was the first Native American justice to hold a seat on any court in the United States. She was appointed to the court in 2016 by Governor Mark Dayton. Before her appointment to the Supreme Court, she served as Hennepin County District Judge. As District Judge, she worked for 1 year in the criminal division, then for several years in family court. And from 2013 to 2016, she's the presiding judge of family court. And from 1992 to 2008, she served as assistant Hennepin County attorney. She was in court daily representing the county in child protection matters and in cases governed by the Indian Child Welfare Act. She was a passionate and strong advocate for children. And as an attorney and judge, she has been a national leader in developing protocols and programs for child protection and Indian child welfare. And finally, Delegate Danica Rome was elected in 2017 and made history as the first openly transgender woman to serve in any state legislature in America. Running on a platform of traffic and road improvements, raising teacher pay, and expanding access to healthcare, she unseated a 20-year House of Delegates incumbent. Born in Manassas, Virginia, and received a bachelor's degree in journalism from St. Bonaventure University. Her professional experience includes working as a journalist and a news editor. In 2018, Rum was included on the cover of Time magazine in their Avengers feature, highlighting new women candidates and elected officials from around the country. Also in 2018, she earned the Gainesville Times Prince William Times Reader's Choice Award for Best Local Politician because of her focus on constituency services. So with that, I would also like to introduce our moderator for the afternoon, and then I will be done. So next slide, please. I'd like for you all to meet our esteemed moderator, Charles Ellison. He's a senior fellow to the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments East Regional Conference. He's also a founding principal of Washington, D.C.-based B&E Strategy and publisher of the BENote.com. A Philadelphia native, Charles is also widely known as a host and executive producer and creator of Check, a daily public affairs program in Philly, editor of Eco.com, an environmental journalism initiative, and numerous editor for Philadelphia Citizen, an award-winning thought leader, political strategist, and crisis media strategy. Find him on Twitter at Ellison Report. With that, I will hand it over to our moderator.
All right. Thanks so much, Dina. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for the introduction. I hope you have me there on video. There we go. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe good morning to some. I'm Charles Ellison. Thanks for that introduction, Dina. Thank you for introducing our panelists. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your Wednesday, out of your midday, midweek to be here. Once again, I'm Charles Ellison. You can catch me on twitter.com at Ellison Report. I'm highly engaged there if you'd like to reach me or tune in to Reality Check on WURD Radio daily every Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We do a daily dose of politics, public affairs. So happy to see you there as well. Let's get our conversation started. First, there is a poll question. You can participate in this. We have some interactive features to this discussion. The poll question today is, what are you excited to learn about in this discussion? What are you excited to learn about today? Is it barriers to inclusive policy? Is it the panelists' personal experiences with overcoming inequality? Or is it prioritizing inclusive language in policy? Ensuring diversity and stakeholder participation and thought? Or other, just leave a comment in the chat box and then we'll take care of the rest. So that's your poll for the day. That will remain. And in fact, I'll go ahead and take it. Maybe I'm one of the first to take that poll, but feel free to participate in our poll. And I'm told you can also leave some questions for us that I will get to later. Let's go to our first panelist, first set of questions. We're already seeing the poll results as well. Appreciate that. Appreciate everyone for participating in that poll. And let's go to Maryland delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, who also will be joining us now. Delegate, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me, Charles.
Excellent, excellent. So talk about your story and how that story influenced your decision to run for office in the first place. And why Maryland? Because I understand you grew up in New York.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I first want to say thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank CSG for having this important discussion. And it is an honor to be with these very impressive panelists. And to you who are at home, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. So when I think about the theme of this webinar, it triggers the memory of a young girl. I came to this country with my mother and my sister when I was almost 8 years old. My father had arrived in New York ahead of us. And while there, he met someone. When my mom arrived with my sister and I, my mother and father divorced. And my mother, sister, and I started in New York City, living together in one room. Probably not an unusual immigrant story. As a single mother, my mother struggled to learn a skill to get a job to support her family. She worked hard sewing clothing and other jobs, and she did support us. And like many immigrants, she also sent money home to support her mother and extended family. I remember living with my grandparents and my mom's siblings. There were 17 of us in a 3-bedroom home. And sometimes we didn't even have a meal. And in the beginning, my mom couldn't make ends meet. We were on welfare for a while. Now, my mother didn't speak English, so when she had to go to the welfare office to meet with a caseworker, she took me with her to translate, to be her voice. So that's where my advocacy started. And while they're waiting for our appointment, I found myself, Charles, drawn into translating for other families. But even at that age, it wasn't just translating, it was advocacy. I was pleading the case for those other women that also needed help, and it was mostly women. And at that age, I learned everyone's business. I had no, I should not have been learning about people's business at that age, at 8 years old. Now, I don't know if there's a direct line from that experience on Sherman Avenue in Washington Heights, New York, where we live, and me becoming a lawyer. But there has always been something in me that wanted to speak up for people that are having a hard time and need a strong voice. In law school, my summers were spent representing prisoners on death row in Alabama and migrant farm workers. I remember when I was, young, 8 years old, seeing my mom and looking at her struggles and telling myself, I want better than this. I want to get an education to help her out. I recall her saying to me, when I die, I'm not going to leave you anything because I won't have it, but you're going to get an education. I remember how my sister became pregnant and had a child at 16, and how I didn't want that for my mom and I and my sister. I didn't want my mom to have to go through that with me as well. I remember going to my high school counselor and saying, I want to go to college, not knowing what that was, and not even knowing how to fill out an application and getting help. And I remember her saying, where do you want to go? And I said, anywhere away from New York City. And I applied to the New York State system, got into most of the schools, and opted for Buffalo, New York. Now, this island girl had never been to Buffalo, New York. I didn't know it snowed. And I arrived there with a blizzard of 85. And I worked hard because my mom instilled that in me. And I wanted to always, as I said, be a voice. So when I finished college and went to law school, I traveled during the summers. And I tell people that I mentor, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to go where the opportunities present themselves, especially for us, people of color, okay, which is so hard to volunteer because we don't have the resources to volunteer. I remember graduating and going to Philadelphia, where I knew no one, and being a public defender. I loved the job. I was good at it in a humble way, but I was one of those people that didn't pass the bar, immediately. And English is my second language. So I had a hard time, and I lost the job because I didn't pass the bar. But I was told, when you pass, your job is there for you. And I eventually passed it. But then I had a better offer, an offer of marriage. And I got married to my boyfriend at the time, who's my husband today. And I decided to stay in the DC area, became a court-appointed lawyer, did a good job at it, and then ended up applying to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I ended up being a U.S. attorney with Eric Holder at the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. So that was basically my path. I didn't really have role models, but I was blessed to meet good people along the way. I never thought I would run for office. And after I had my kids, I was very involved in the community and decided to volunteer in the community, and then run for the local city council, and then run for the state house, where I have been 14 years. So I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for this country, if it weren't for the opportunities, and if it weren't for my mother, who instilled those values of hard work and persistence and dedication in me, which a lot of us immigrant and people of color have.
Yeah, So much of that story, as you mentioned earlier, is about speaking up for people, right? Speaking up for whether it's yourself or it's your family or it's for others. The value of advocacy and representation. So let's talk about that a little bit more and pack it from the perspective of inclusion, right? Like from your personal perspective, from that story you just described, what are the benefits? Now you're a delegate, now you're a lawmaker. What are the benefits of inclusive public policy? First, also, how do we define inclusion?
Yeah, so I would say you define it by having everyone at the table, by putting on a racial lens, right? And looking at that room, when you're in that room, you must think and analyze who's missing from this room. And when I am in a hearing, that's what I do, Charles. I look and say, okay, how many women? How many African American? How many Latinos? How many men? Like, you must make sure that people are at the table. So when I work on legislation, for example, I always try to include a broad variety of stakeholders. This uncovers the issues and brings us to consensus much faster. So for example, I start early with my proposed legislation, and I have meetings with stakeholders, lots and lots of meetings. I'm working right now on a bill that will declare racism as a public health crisis in the state of Maryland. And it's not just a resolution, because I am not interested in that. It is a bill that will measure those illnesses that affect us Black and Brown people, because we know that we have been hurt and affected the most with COVID, right? We have most of those cases. So I brought to the table everyone that I could think of that would have, they would not be happy with the legislation and that I needed to bring to the table. I had 27 people on a Zoom call, to make sure that they were there in the department. And the bill measures those illnesses that affect us, like diabetes, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, asthma. So I brought the doctors to the table, the different boards, the insurance company, the department as well. So I try to be inclusive and think of who is going to be affected by that policy. Are they at the table? Did they get an opportunity to review the policy that I'm proposing? Did I allow them an opportunity to amend that bill, to give me their language, to tell me how it affects them? And I always try to do that in every piece of legislation I have, because it's the right thing to do, because it's going to affect everyone. And you want to be represented. You want to be fair. It is the right thing to do.
Yeah, what you just described was something of like a template, right? Kind of a model for creating inclusive and equitable public policy. Do you think that is possible? I mean, in those kinds of experiences as you're crafting legislation, including the legislation you're crafting now, is there a model that we could sort of apply to all states where inclusive, equitable policy is being created and that policy is effectively addressing systemic inequalities and gaps that exist?
Absolutely. And you first have to acknowledge that there's an issue, right? We have to acknowledge and educate that racism exists, that inequalities exist, that prejudice exists, that disparity exists. So you have to look at your data that you have in your state, because the data, believe it or not, the science and the data are so important. They speak for itself. And then you go from that data and you basically present it, you educate people, and then you bring everyone to the table, whether they're going to like it or not, because at the end of the day, they're going to see that policy and they're going to want to opine on that policy. And I've done it in Maryland, and I put in a bill that is the first of its kind in the nation, in the US, that creates the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? To look at the number of lynchings that we have had in Maryland, to hold hearings, to talk to families and witnesses, and to make recommendations to the General Assembly as to how do we honor those lives, right? So we have to look at our history to know where we're going and to understand our future. And it is doable. It's doable if you communicate with people, if you educate people, and if you look at the data. And I do that with every bill I put in, and it works. in a very humble way, it works because people want to be at the table. You just have to give them a chance.
Yeah, yeah. We have you for about another minute or so, Delegate. I am real curious. You were the first in your family to attend college. You were an equal opportunity program scholar. I remember you saying that when you look back on it now, you see how much you benefited from programs that opened doors for minority students. If you could speak briefly about that, about how important, like existing inclusive policies and programs like the Equal Opportunity Scholar Program, for example, are to providing equitable opportunity to all, like why we need to keep maintaining those types of programs and initiatives.
Well, Charles, it's important because I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for that program. Frankly speaking, my mother could not afford it. She will send me sometimes, and I love her, and she passed away 12 years ago in a car accident. She saw me be elected to the House. And even though she's not around, thank you, I reflect my mom. I tell my kids that all the time. It's important because her $30, $20 now and then that she would send me in college was not going to get me through college. And programs like this offer an opportunity for people like myself, people that are not traditionally given an opportunity or cannot afford college, to be at the table. How can a young girl that came from the Dominican Republic, that lived with her grandparents, 17 people in a little house, that came with a mother who didn't speak English, who was on welfare for a while, whose sister became pregnant, who didn't have the role models, how can she become this woman that's in front of you today in a humble way? She can be here today because of opportunities like that, that allow me to have the money to go to college. And then it said, if you go and get through college, we'll pay for your law school as well. It didn't pay for my rent or for my books. I had to borrow and put it on credit card, but it did help because I didn't have to worry about the tuition. And I want to thank Charles that I paid it back and that I'm making a difference with the policies and the way I represent people, and that I'm giving back to my community. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that. There was no way that I would be here today because I couldn't afford it.
All right, Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick joining us here. Thank you so much, Delegate. Really appreciate your time. I'm sure you'll be joining us a little bit later on as we open up for more questions to this very special panel providing us with all these insights about equity and inclusion. Thank you so much, Delegate, for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we're going to talk to you a little bit later on as well, so stand by. We're now going to be talking with Pennsylvania State Representative Brian Sims, and we have him on camera in a moment. Representative Sims from our hometown of Philadelphia. How are you doing, Representative?
I'm good, Charles. It's good to see you, sir.
All right, good to see you as well. So you've got quite a bit of an impressive background. We heard about that in your bio. Talk about how your story leads to you now being a policymaker.
Well, thank you again, and thanks to everybody that's joining us. And to have listened now to Delegate Pena-Melnick's story, as I do with a lot of my colleagues that I know have advocacy backgrounds or that are advocate legislators, it's a very familiar thing to hear of a background that drives somebody to run for office versus just wanting to be a legislator, which we all work with people that have wanted those jobs. For me, I'm the son of two retired lieutenant colonels in the Army, and I grew up at Army bases all across the United States. And the unusual part of my childhood was having a mother who was a ranking officer. And on every base I ever lived on, usually their fathers and the husbands were officers or soldiers, and their wives were not. And that was very different in my household. And I grew up in a house that had, I would say, a lot of equality in it. While my parents each had sort of roles that they had in their marriage and in their relationship, none of them ever had anything to do with any gender dynamics. And so as I grew older, it became very clear to me that the sort of sexism and misogyny of the real world was a very real thing. And so my good friends will tell you that I from a very young age thought that I was going to be a feminist lawyer. That's what I used to tell people as a little kid. I'm going to be a feminist lawyer. And I took my entrance exams to law school very young. I was 16 years old when I took my LSATs, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do. What changed, and not a whole lot changed, but when I went off to college, I came out of the closet my last year at Bloomsburg University, a little college in northeastern Pennsylvania. And so when I went off to law school, not only was I continuing to work on women's and reproductive rights, but my own identity as a gay man began to play into it. And I didn't know, Charles, that when I moved to Philadelphia to practice law, that while I was moving to the city that had some of the best or strongest laws for LGBTQ Americans, I was moving to a state that had none. And I spent a number of years advocating, first as the head of Equality Pennsylvania for change, and then trying to elect out people to our legislature. There's a data point that no state that had ever passed any type of comprehensive relationship recognition laws, for example, had ever done so without first electing out legislators. And Pennsylvania was the largest state in the country that had not done that. And so I tried for a number of years to elect a couple of colleagues of mine, including a woman named Dr. Fern Kaufman. She was just a badass. She would have been the perfect first out legislator in our state. And we came really close and it didn't happen. And I spent a couple of years pretty frustrated about it. And my close friend sort of sat me down and said, listen, you're the person you're looking for. And I didn't agree at the time, but within about a year or so, I announced that I was going to run against my incumbent state rep, who had been in office since I was 6 years old. And I ran. I won by my first election by 233 votes. And what I told people is that I lecture regularly about privilege, about what it means to advocate and to be an activist for racial and ethnic justice, for LGBTQ civil rights, for first and second generation immigrants, for all of those issues. And here I am, the sort of living embodiment of a number of those privileges that I would do my best to not have to force women to stand up and speak about the how awful sexism and misogyny is every single time an issue comes up that involves those things, or to not ask my colleagues of color to always have to talk about this deep-seated personal issues just in order to get colleagues that look just like me to understand them better. And so, I was, for the first 6 years that I was in office, the only out legislator in Pennsylvania. I have been joined since by Malcolm Kenyatta, who serves here also in Philadelphia. And we just elected a woman named Jess Benham, who is openly bisexual, from Pittsburgh. And I'm very proud that they've joined us, but it's been a long haul in a state that still does not recognize my equality.
So, you being the first, you're a trailblazer, the first openly gay elected legislator in Pennsylvania history. So what does it mean for those you serve? I wonder, like what that, relationship is like with your constituents, how you represent them, particularly in the context of your LGBTQ identity.
Sure. Well, and thank you for the question. It's a housekeeping matter. I often talk about LGBT or LGBTQ issues. I hope everyone understands that means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Not transgendered. It's not a word, although I hear it used a lot. It's like saying gayed or lesbian. So thank you for the question. It's actually a sort of a multi-part answer. One is that how my colleagues perceive me has a pretty big impact, in that for the longest time, a lot of the opposition to LGBTQ equality was falsely sort of put upon this shelf of, well, I don't know anybody that's LGBTQ, and therefore I don't understand, and therefore I can't vote on these issues. That was sort of a lot of the opposition to LGBTQ rights for a very long time. That sort of combined with the generalized religious opposition. Well, we knew in the 2000 census that LGBTQ people were in 99.8% of counties in America back then. They were probably too busy running those other 0.2% of counties to fill out the paperwork. And so this idea that I don't know anybody LGBTQ was still something that a lot of my colleagues were saying openly until I was elected. Now, you did me the honor of introducing me as the first out elected member of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. But my workplace has had has had gay people in it for all time, just not openly LGBTQ. And that openness does play a major role in how we are perceived. The other component of that is that I'm a cisgender white middle-class man. And the part of the reason that the rainbow represents the LGBTQ community is because we are so much more than just that. And it's not that it does an injustice to the other members of my great communities that for so long I've been the only person to speak on our behalf. But it does do an injustice to the myriad of issues that are also LGBTQ issues. Issues like raising the minimum wage because so many of our families fall below that range. People ask me all the time about discrimination, for example, that I might have faced. And it's very easy to say it pales in comparison to the daily discrimination faced by a trans Latina, for example, in a major city. And so the work for me isn't about sort of stemming the tide of things that have happened to me or making my colleagues see that it can also happen to someone like me, because it's so much, frankly, it's so much more expansive than that and has to be. And so if nothing else, while I think that my straight white colleagues look at me sometimes like a translator, I think I'm more of a spy.
Thank you for that. When you look at those, you were listening to what Delegate Pena Melnick was talking about and about the importance of inclusion. We're going to be talking even a little bit more about that when we have you all in the roundtable session. But talk about those, those general benefits. Well, one, do you think that there's a model or a framework for like more inclusive, equitable policy? And then what are those benefits when you make that public policy making framework much more diverse? How do you go about it?
Well, she actually said something that really fascinated me, and that was about taking a seat at the table. My favorite out member of Congress, Barney Frank, used to say that if you don't have a seat at the table, you are probably on the menu. And that's something that feels very familiar to people. And part of the reason it feels so familiar is because there are so many of us, as she referenced, not having role models as a young person to look to see who can I grow into, who can I become? Well, one of the great things that I know about these issues is that political science is a real thing. We call it political science and not political art because it is measurable and trackable and we can understand trends. And the truth of the matter is that the political science and the social science tells us that a background of marginalization, whether that be because of a racial and ethnic identity, sometimes because of a religious identity, because of a sexual orientation or gender identity, identities as first and second generation immigrants. A background of marginalization grows in many people sort of this extreme sense of empathy, measurable empathy which is incredibly useful in problem solving, it's useful in business, and it's sure as heck useful in government. If you want a business to succeed right now in America, you better have a first or second generation immigrant involved, and you better have women in leadership because those metrics tell us that's what success looks like right now in business. And it's for real world purposes. We've been dismissing these things for so long as, trans excellence, Black girl magic, wise Latinas, women's intuition, but all of those are the skills that are built upon trying to survive and thrive in a world that is not made for you. And what that has become is an ability to govern very well, to lead very well, to problem spot very well. If we were going to scrap everything and start over with government right now, but use the social and political science that we know, we'd chalk our government filled with wise Latinas, with trans women, with Black girls and their magic. And we would do it because we'd know that was the path to success. If we're trying to put the most appropriately skilled people in the jobs where they will thrive the best for the most people, this is what we would be doing. It's nice that we have a representative democracy and therefore we should have a democracy that looks more like the people that it represents. But it goes much, much deeper than that when it comes to the skills and abilities of those people.
All right, Representative Sims, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know you'll be hanging around for our once we transition into roundtable mode a little bit later on. Thanks again. We're going to transition from you to now Hawaii Representative Val Okimoto, who will be joining us by camera in a quick instant. And Representative, how are you doing?
Aloha, everyone. Thank you. It's still morning here, but I know in everywhere else it's in the afternoon. So good afternoon.
I'm sure we would all want to be there for a Hawaii morning. So,
welcome. Finish travel is much easier.
thank you so much. Yes, when we get on the other side of this, indeed. Representative Okimoto, let's talk about your background, your story, fascinating as well, and how that timeline brought you to the point where you decided to run for office finally one day. What happened?
Sometimes I look back on where I am and I think, how in the world did I end up here? Because literally my story, first of all, I want to just thank the speakers before me. I'm so impressed and amazed and just grateful to be in the presence of, such amazing women, women leaders across our country. But I am a local, born and raised Hawaii girl, raised on the little island of Hawaii. I live on Oahu now and I represent a district here, but I grew up on the island of Hawaii. My paternal grandparents were actually immigrant plantation workers. So they immigrated here from the Philippines. And, I look at the story of my ancestors and I think how wonderful the sacrifices they made to ensure that my parents had a better life. And now I've been able to have a better life. But a quick background, yeah, my grandparents were Filipino immigrant plantation workers. On my mother's side, she actually was raised by a Native Hawaiian woman. However, she was adopted into that family. I am myself a multi-ethnic. I am Filipino, Japanese, and Caucasian. So one of the wonderful things about Hawaii is that there really is no dominant, I think, ethnicity, because a lot of us are just multi-ethnic. And I grew up in this melting pot that I have been able to call home my whole life. So I was raised very humbly. My parents were both government employees. My dad was a firefighter, first responder, and my mom worked for a state office, a government department. And, neither of my parents had had never received a bachelor's degree. So just, again, humble beginnings, but they wanted to ensure that my siblings and I had a better future. So I was able to graduate from college, and I always think about how I was very business minded. My direction in life was to be a business person. I have an accounting degree. That was my path in life. And my junior year in college, I did something that I had wanted to do my whole life, and that was to do a service mission for my church. And I was able to go to the Philippines. I lived in the Philippines, a third world country, for nearly a year and a half. And I have to say that decision in my life really changed the trajectory of everything that has happened to me since. It really made me come down to what the core of me is, and that's service oriented and community. I came back from that service mission, finished my last year, and got my accounting degree, but knew in my heart that wasn't where my passion or my path in life was. So as shared earlier, I got certified and became a special education teacher, and I did that for 10 years. Loved it, but also it's very challenging, and I can share some of that, further on. I did stay home, and in that meantime, I became a mom. I have two beautiful daughters, and they're raised here. Also, I became a mom, and for about 8 years, I was a full-time stay-at-home mom. In that time, I got really involved in my community, served in different capacities, leadership in church, but got into different organizations, and I got into the association that's kind of runs our planned community, and that really got me involved in and interacting. And somehow I became the go-between between our community and our elected officials. So in Hawaii, we have such wonderful, things about our state that make us so unique and why I love it here. But there appears to be a disconnect between the community and our elected officials. And during that time of serving in the community, I really realized that we need to have a bridge. My friends would come and tell me, go ask the representative, go ask the senator. And I thought, why do you feel that you can't do that? Why can't we hold our elected officials accountable for what we elect them to do? And so in 2018, my district became an open seat, and I got asked to run, and I thought it was the craziest idea. I don't come from politics. I didn't even run for student government in school. I literally had no political background other than serving in my community. But I really wanted to give the everyday person in my community a voice and a choice. So I threw my hat in, I ran for office, and it was hard. Probably the scariest thing I've done, even outside of being a mom and living in a third world country and having to learn a new language. This was by far very scary for someone like me who had not experienced that type of, community service up until that point. My first campaign, and I worked really hard, and it was very grounded, boots on the ground. I just got out in the community, and that's where my passion is very rooted in the people. And so I was able to win that first election, serve my first two sessions, and this year had another tough race, but I worked hard again, and COVID made it difficult because somebody like me who is a grassroots campaigner and walking and getting out in the community, that was limited due to COVID and our constant shutdowns here in Hawaii. We have a very strict guidelines that were placed upon us. But I'm a believer in, doing what is right and for the right reasons. So my passion to serve has nothing to do with title or power or authority. It really is to represent that everyday person. I felt that if I could inspire anyone else, if anything, my daughters, my 2 young daughters, I wanted them to see a strong woman who stands up and against all odds. Really, both of my campaigns, I'm against all odds. And Yoshi, we'll talk about this. I'm in the minority here in Hawaii, and I don't know any other state that has a staggering difference between the majority and minority. But that was one thing I wanted to, instill in my daughters, and just anybody who grew up and feels like they're against all odds, and show that they can do it.
I do want to ask you too, before we get to that, you were at one point, you were a special education teacher. Before, serving in the Hawaii House of Representatives. And so you talk a lot about, and you try to help create policies that include individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Talk about that work, because, typically when we talk about inclusion and also creating equitable policy and diversity, we always talk about, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, inclusion along those lines. And in the mainstream conversation and discourse, we don't often talk about as much as we should folks with disabilities. And so talk a little bit about that work.
Thank you for that question. I think one thing that I realized when I came in, I felt maybe I lacked the knowledge of policy or the experience. I had never worked in the building. Many of the legislators had worked in an office before. I thought what I brought strongly to the table was that my experience in the classroom. So I serve on the education committee. I did my first term, and I will continue to. And I realized quickly that while there were maybe 1 or 2 other legislators in my chamber who had been teachers, I was the only one that was a special education teacher. And I of course, hats off to all teachers. I think there's great respect there. But when you're a special education teacher, you see things differently. By far, I worked in the 10 years. I had worked in kindergarten through 8th grade, and just dealing with different types of disabilities. You have a broad spectrum, whether it's, mental disabilities, emotional, learning disabilities. I have autistic kids, physical disabilities. I even had a non-ambulatory student. So just being able to see the policy that came through our committees and see it through the eyes of not just a former teacher, but from my students, it really, really helped me to have that perspective. And I would respectfully, voice my questions or concerns based on what I knew the keiki. So in Hawaii, we call kids keiki. The keiki would go through on a day-to-day basis. Something that I'm really passionate about as an educator, and I want my children to, of course, go to college if that's their path. But I fight hard to have all kinds of education. Most of my students that I still call them my students, they weren't going to be the ones to go to a 4-year university and get a college degree. So I fight really hard to have policy on having them get a skill or we have the CT, career technology education, apprenticeship, or something that will allow them to be, contributing members of society. I think they're forgotten, and we need to remember that everybody can bring something. That you can bring something to the table. And for me, recognizing that these students who have, for some reason or another, some form of disability that doesn't allow them to learn the way that we're taught to learn, that doesn't discredit their capabilities or what they can contribute or offer. And it's our job, really, as I still might consider myself a teacher, but as legislators now, to make sure that we're bridging that gap, or we're offering something, that we're not forgetting these students, I call of mine.
This also, this last question, while we have a couple more minutes here, and you had mentioned this about a few moments ago, you're one of 4 conservative legislators in the Hawaii legislature. And how do you balance that, right? Like, how do you work to ensure that your conservative perspective is incorporated into those policy conversations, and in a legislature that's dominated by competitors who are not conservative?
Another great question. I will say that to be in the minority here is definitely not for the faint of heart. And in Hawaii, I grew up in the majority side. My parents, again, were government workers, and the culture here, again, is mixed. We have ethnic cultures, but also traditions and cultures that have been passed on from generation to generation. So when I came out and said, I'm going to run on this side, the aisle, I still get, because I'm a minority female, and they look at me and they're like, no, you're a local kid, you're supposed to be on the other side. And I will say that there's great value in recognizing what you stand for, but respecting what's being stood for across the aisle. I've been able to form relationships and gain the respect because you can find almost anything in common with somebody, and I value that. I think that's something I've learned during my first and second campaign, that even though we may not agree on everything, for the most part, we can agree on many things, or at least some things. So because of that, I've been able to gain respect by working respectfully across the aisle. Most of the issues, with fiscal or business or cultural policies, we can talk about. So when it comes down to the nitty gritty, where I'm going to be on one side and they're on the other, we know that it's not because of a personal attack or because we're angry. It's just because that's how we are. And there's, in Hawaii, because again, we're so diverse in culture, or a melting pot. I think it's important to always remember that you can respectfully disagree, but hear each other's side out. I think I break the norm in many ways. I heard earlier about I've been called a unicorn in so many ways, because I am an anomaly, that I don't look like the classic a Republican. That's what, they have an image of what you're supposed to look like. And I don't look like that. I don't act like that. I think I stand for certain things. I represent my community, but I listen and I'm able to hear things out. So to get things done, respectfully, build that trust as much as possible in politics, and find out the nonpartisan issues that you can agree upon. So when it does come to the parts that you can agree, I go to my senators who are across the aisle, and we're friends, and I say, I voted no on your bill, and we talk about it. They argue their point, I discuss mine, we laugh, and then we stop. And that's just how it is. And I think if we can have more of that discussion in politics, then it's not so personal. You really make it about the issues. And at the end of the day, our communities are the ones who vote us. And that's why I go back to my community and what do they stand for. And as long as I'm representing them properly, and I'm living my life the best way that I can for my children always, then I can sleep at night at the end of the day.
Hawaii State Representative Val Okimoto has been joining us, talking about her experience there in the Hawaii State Legislature from the Aloha State. Really appreciate it, Representative. Thanks so much. I know you'll be hanging around, and you'll be joining us in our roundtable session, which will be coming up soon as well. In the meantime, we're going to transition from Representative Okimoto to now Minnesota State Supreme Court Associate Justice Ann McKay, and she should be joining us shortly right now. Justice, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
All right, good. Thanks so much for joining us now. Well, it's afternoon out here on the West Coast, I believe it is too, where you are in Minnesota.
That it is.
Talk about your story. You are, or you were at one point the first Native Indigenous American justice to serve on any court in the U.S. So share with us how your story, that trajectory from your story, your personal story, to now serving as a Minnesota State Associate Supreme Court Justice, serving the people of Minnesota. How has that identity made you who you are, and also informed how you contributed to the people of Minnesota in your work?
First of all, thank you, and thanks to CSG for allowing me to be here. And it's been great listening to all of these stories. It's inspiring. Yeah, I have a interesting, well, maybe interesting, maybe not, but I grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation in northwestern Minnesota. My hometown is 106 people, which is a very small town. It's a couple of stop signs. I have 4 brothers, as you can see, the picture that's on the left there. And my dad is a member of the White Earth Nation, which is the symbol that I have behind me, which is our tribal flag. And then my mom is of Polish descent, and my mom played in a dance band, and that's actually how they met. My mother was from Bemidji, which is a little bit bigger town, but my dad was raised on the reservation in Federal Dam. So they met, married, had 5 children. We grew up with very simple means. A lot of times it was well under $30,000 a year for a family of 7. We had 3 gardens. We did a lot of hunting. We did a lot of fishing. It was a great childhood. I didn't know that we really didn't have money. Although I knew that other kids at school had things that I didn't have, but it was never explained to me in a way that made me feel like I was missing out in any way. It was just sort of that they just chose different things. So it was a great childhood, lots of freedom. I knew that it was always expected that I was going to go to college because my mother was an educator. My dad was a union guy. He was a construction guy. He sort of believed that if you didn't get your hands dirty, that you didn't hold a lot of value. So he believed in physical labor and the ability to do that. And so I really had like this best of both worlds. You know, my mom believing that education was important and my dad believing in hard work. And so out of that just came this fact that I was going to go to college, and my mom had gone to college in the Twin Cities, which was about 4 hours away from the reservation. And so I went off to St. Catherine's, and I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I actually knew that in 9th grade. People have asked me that, you know, the question comes up when you get on the court, like, well, when did you want to become a lawyer? And how did you know you wanted to become a lawyer? And I really have no idea. My mom ran the Indian education program, and I always saw my mom as helping a lot of kids. There was a lot of youth who had major struggles out on the reservation. There was lots of sadness. And so I know that my mother was the keeper of a lot of secrets, and I think she helped a lot of kids. And so I wanted to be like that. But I decided I was going to go to law school in 9th grade. And I remember, you know, getting the pat on the head from people who would come, because I started work when I was 13. I worked 2 jobs to save money to go to college. And I'd get the pat on the head from people who would come, and they'd be like, oh, isn't that nice? This little girl from this town wants to be a lawyer. Nobody probably really thinking that I was going to. So I went off to college, did a okay job at college, and then off to law school. And then it was time to get a job. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, because I just knew that I had to get a job. And it didn't matter what it was. I had to make money, because if I didn't make money, I was going to have to move back north and back home with my parents, because there wasn't an alternative plan. And so I got a job with the county attorney's office, and I landed in this division, which was child protection, where I was representing social workers working with kids who've been abused and neglected. And that was really fortunate for me, because I didn't know anything about that, but it made a lot of sense, because I certainly saw that in growing up on the reservation. And so it was the perfect fit for me. And then as a part of that, I met Judge Blazer, who was the first Native American on the district court judge in the Twin Cities. And he became my mentor, not because I sought him out, but because he knew that I needed a mentor. And he took me under his wing. And one day after I got on the district court, he came to me and said there was an opening on the Minnesota Supreme Court, and that I was going to apply. And I thought he'd lost his mind. And I said, but I don't want to do that. And he said, it's not about you, it's about our community. And it's time for us to have a seat at the table, and it's time for you to give back. And so you are going to apply. And so I did, and the rest is history.
Wow, wow. You know, and talk about too, how your native, your indigenous identity in the judicial system, what that means to you, and also what you think it means to people you serve in Minnesota. And does that in any way you think benefit the broader Native community in your state?
Well, I certainly hope so. I will say that when I got on the district court, it was a big deal, but I didn't feel as much pressure as I felt when I got on the Supreme Court, because I knew I was going to be the first female in the entire country. And I certainly had concerns about whether I would be accepted, whether my Native brothers and sisters would accept it, what people would think of me. I knew there was a big responsibility that I couldn't mess up, that if I did, it would have negative consequences for others. And so I felt that, and it was overwhelming. And there was a point in time on the court when I actually thought about leaving, because I really felt like I didn't belong there. for lots of reasons. But on the flip side, I could have never expected what it has meant for people. I've had people come out of the woodwork who have called the court, and that wouldn't have happened before. I mean, kids that I removed from their parents, so I was not a popular person with them, they have called the court as young adults, and they've needed help in some capacity, and they didn't know who else to call, and they felt like I was a fair person, and they're like, oh, we saw you on the news, and we need help because we need a lawyer, or my grandma needs help because of X, Y, and Z. It's been amazing. And so that just spoke to me about this need for more of us to be out there, because if they're calling the Minnesota Supreme Court to get help for things that have really nothing to do with the court, that tells me something.
Yeah, yeah. When you have more diverse judges, justices who are on the bench, do we see better outcomes, you think?
Absolutely.
People, and with more diverse identities on the bench, how does that work? And there's that constant discussion about, things like criminal justice reform, the need to make the justice system much more inclusive, less punitive for populations of color, Black and Brown, Latino populations, Indigenous populations. But do you think there's better outcomes when you have more diverse representation on the bench?
Yeah, absolutely. And that includes geographical diversity in a state, and it also includes economic diversity, because I think that when you have that broad diversity, we're able to actually sort of know the experiences of the people who are the consumers of court, what it is like for them. And if there's an inability to have that connection when you're the one who's making decisions about those who are coming before you, and you sort of hold their lives or their outcomes in your hand, that if there's a disconnect for that, well, then you're not going to perhaps render a very good decision. And so it's important from the district court and certainly all the way up through the appellate court. And I'll tell you, Minnesota is lucky because we have 7 justices on our court, and of the 7, we have a female chief justice. We have a first openly out gay justice. We have our African-American justice, as in Justice Hudson, and she's the second. And then I'm the first Native justice. And that's a pretty rich court, and it allows for a really rich discussion, because with that, people bring their viewpoints, their philosophies, and their backgrounds, and it allows for us to be thinking about things that we might not be bringing to the table alone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the Minnesota State Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I have a question about that a little bit later on in our roundtable discussion with all our panelists. Justice McKeag, thanks so much for that perspective, for your insights there. Really appreciate that. Hang on, we're going to have you in our later discussion, which is coming up after we talk with we're going to be transitioning from Minnesota State Supreme Court Justice, Associate Justice McKeag, to now Virginia State Delegate Danica Rome, and she's joining us now from Virginia, from the state for lovers, as they call it. I actually have my mother's family is from Virginia, so I'm very familiar with Virginia. And Delegate Rome now joins us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Greetings from snowy Virginia here. It's good to see y'all.
Excellent, excellent. How did you decide to run for office? And now you're the first openly transgender legislator in the United States. Wasn't the first time that someone transgender had attempted to run for office, but how did that trajectory, your personal story, have you ending up deciding to run for office and in a state like Virginia?
Sure. So like a lot of women, I was recruited to run. The statistics that we see from Emerge America, and I trained through Emerge Virginia, and they train Democratic women how to run for office, shows that even though this is nowhere near universal whatsoever, women are very often asked to run where men often take initiative to run. And in 2016, it was August 4th, 2016, the Democratic nominee in 2015, Don Shaw, he sent me an email saying, hey, I've got to move out, so I'm not gonna be able to run again. Have you considered running? You'd be really good. And when I saw it, I just kind of laughed. And the next day, I got a phone call from State Delegate Rip Sullivan, who is the House Democratic Caucus recruiting chairman. And he asked, hey, have you considered running to be a good candidate? And I knew immediately what my campaign was going to focus on if I were to run, and that would be fixing Route 28, because my mom had been driving up and down 28 to get to her job near Dulles International Airport from here in Manassas, and it's about a 20-mile drive or so. She'd been doing that commute for, going more than 35 years by that point, 37 years. And there had been no significant change in the Prince William County or Centerville sections of 28, since the mid 1980s. And so given that my predecessor was the self-described chief homophobe of Virginia, who had been elected 13 times, serving 26 years in office, I said that, his legislative priorities were more concerned about where I go to the bathroom now his constituents got to work. And so I decided to go run and go do something about it. And well, I did. And now, we've got a lot of improvements of Route 28 underway right now as I'm speaking. I've got a big one that's going up in front of the Commonwealth Transportation Board coming this upcoming January that directly deals with, the district I represent. And at the same time, I'm still working to make Virginia a more inclusive Commonwealth. So no matter what you look like, where you come from, how you worship if you do, or who you love, that you're welcome, celebrated, respected, and protected here because of who you are, not despite it. And, the reality of being a trans woman running, I had trained with the LGBTQ Victory Fund from November 17th to 20th. Actually, that was the Victory Institute during their candidate campaign training program that's entirely tailored for LGBTQ candidates. And although no one like me had served as an out person in state legislature, Althea Garrison had been elected for one term in Massachusetts in the 90s, but she was outed while in office. I saw my identity as something where people would actually rally around it, as opposed to, denigrate me for it, even though I knew I was going to get attacked. I knew that was coming. I spent 10.5 years as a newspaper reporter. And during that time, I worked 2 full-time jobs for 4 out of 5 years at one point, including a 3.5-year stint covering federal campaigns and state campaigns when I was writing for the Hotline, which is part of the National Journal, working out of the Watergate in Washington, D.C. So I knew exactly what I was getting myself into, and I knew that my race would get national attention. I was well aware of all of that. At the same time, the question becomes, when you have a national platform as a local legislator, what do you do with it? Or as a local candidate? Are you going to kind of fall into that trap of trying to nationalize a race, or are you going to let your identity more or less speak for itself and focus on those universal issues that the people who you're running to represent actually need you to focus on in the first place? In our case, my predecessor had prided himself on constituent service, but when you vote to not expand, when you vote against expanding Medicaid to 400,000 people, including 3,700 of your constituents, that to me was the antithesis of constituent service. So I said I would expand Medicaid. I said we would get Route 28 fixed, and we would raise teacher pay. And by the way, we're doing all 3 of those. And at the same time, I made sure people knew that I unabashedly support inclusivity, and equality, and that, when it comes to, I guess, more or less social issues, I'm going to be a good leader, while at the same time, remember that it's those infrastructure issues that caused me to get off the sidelines and run in the first place.
I'm very familiar with that history in Virginia, just, all the stories. My grandmother, she growing up in segregated Virginia, and my great-grandparents too, I got a chance to know them up until my teenage years, and they talked about that. So Virginia's come a very long way. When I think about those stories, and I think about your experiences as well. So talk about that too, about you being identified as a transgender legislator, and how that informs your policy making, or now, the issues that you're focused on, how much that shapes that policy making.
Sure. So my experience as a trans woman influences my worldview, but it does not replace my qualifications for office. My qualification for office was the 10.5 years I spent, as a newspaper reporter, including 9 years, 2 months, and 2 weeks as the lead reporter of the Gainesville Times, covering the 13th district that I now represent, covering Western Prince William County. And to me, as someone who had stories from all 18 precincts that I now represent from before I ran for office, this is my lifelong home community. I knew what I was, like I said, not only did I knew what I was getting myself into, I knew how to speak the language of the district. And that's not because there's only one language spoken here. We're actually a wildly diverse district. We have people from all over the world who call the 13th district home. But it's the way that you talk about infrastructure, the way that you talk about healthcare, the way you talk about education. Do you really understand the differences when you're going, one day I'm knocking doors at the Bull Run Mobile Home Community Park, and when you're talking to people on a trailer park, they may have different concerns than the people who live in some of the McMansions out in Gainesville and parts of Haymarket. But at the same time, I left the same handwritten note with my personal cell phone number on the doors of the people in the mobile home park that I did in the mansions. And the reason for that is everyone's dignity is exactly the same to me, and that everyone needs their delegate to, represent them and to have a direct line of communication with their delegate. And, one of the funny things about being a reporter is, after 10 years, I got asked, like, are you sure you want to leave your personal cell phone number out, out in the public like this to thousands of people? And I was just like, I spent 10.5 years as a newspaper reporter. I can deal with crazy. I'm not worried about that. That's part of the job description. Most people who call you only call because they have a concern. They're not reaching out to the government to get involved in their lives unless they have to.
Mhm.
And so the way that I saw that, it was, why not make myself as accessible as I can be? And that's what I've really done. But in terms of the history that you're talking about, keep in mind that when I was elected in 2017, it wasn't just me making history in Prince William County, let alone in Virginia, where we had the first two Latinas elected to the House of Delegates between delegates Hala Yala and Elizabeth Guzman. We had the first African-American woman to represent Prince William County, which is the second largest locality in Virginia, in the General Assembly, who is Delegate Jennifer Carroll Floyd, who's now running for governor. And at the same time, we had the first out lesbian in Dawn Adams, who was elected out of Richmond. We have a historic number of Black legislators now just in the House of Delegates in general. And, we have the highest number of women who have actually served, even though men still have more than a 2/3 majority of the House of Delegates, which I think says a lot, considering that this body goes back to 1619. This is a 401-year-old institution. And we are just now getting to, 30 women in the House of Delegates out of 100 members. I think, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked about, what's the appropriate number for women on the Supreme Court, she said 9. To me, anything short of 51 is, less than where we need to be in the House of Delegates. So, part of my long-term work is recruiting women, especially diverse women, to run for office here. And in fact, just today, one of the people I encouraged to run, she just stepped up and announced her candidacy today. And I'm really excited that we are going to continue having a lot of diversity in the House of Delegates from the Prince William delegation.
All right. There's this CSG This Morning interview that you did back in 2019. You were saying that people don't have to pretend to be someone they are not. They can be themselves and succeed. I hope that every person who follows the example that we have set here in the 13th district knows that they can succeed because of who they are, not despite it. I think that's a very profound statement, because we talk so much about compromise in politics and public policy, right? What impact does embracing one's own identity have on the understanding of oneself, but also in understanding and being empathetic to other people's needs and identities?
So one lesson that I learned from covering politics for a long time, keep in mind, I'm 36 years old. I ran for office when I was 32. I won when I was 33. So even though my age is relatively young for politics, I've been around for a good while. I've been around doing this for I'm not new to this. But I remember Senator Tammy Baldwin, who's one of my absolute heroes out of Wisconsin. She is the first lesbian to be elected to the U.S. Senate. And she once, remarked that when she was campaigning, there would be these, rural white men who she would talk to who would say, if you're willing to be honest about being gay, if you're willing to be honest about, the most vulnerable parts of your life and tell me that straight up, then I can probably trust you to be honest with me in general, because that means that you don't have anything to hide. And I think that when people, see their delegate being wildly authentic, that there is a trust that comes with that. And on top of that, people have a problem with the media in general, but they like their local reporters in general as well. And, you know, part of that is, I'm a reporter, I'm a truth teller, I believe in transparency. I put myself out there, extremely active on social media, because it's the easiest way for people to reach me. And at the same time, like I said before, giving out my phone number, you know, just really focusing on constituent service issues has been kind of the name of the game for me. Well, I think that when people see that I'm not just you know, a trans woman running for office, but transgender, metalhead, you know, thrash metal vocalist, reporter, stepmom, yogini, vegetarian, I put all of that out there and I say, okay, you know exactly who I am. There is no ambiguity, there's no surprises, any of that sort of stuff. You know, I will touch all the taboos. I'll put it all out there. And I remember in January of 2017, I filled out a questionnaire saying, have you ever made any mistakes in your life? And I was like, oh yeah, Jesus, where to begin? And I just went through this entire like litany of stuff. And the editor of that publication reached out to me afterward, and he was like, you know, you're the first candidate not to BS that answer. And I really think that that resonates with people, where when I'm knocking on doors, yeah, I've had a handful of, you know, transphobic remarks being made to me. It's part of the turf. I can, you know, I got thick skin, I can deal with it. You know, my mother's from the Bronx, you know, so I've got that toughness. But at the same time, most of the time, if my gender is coming up at the door, it's because, oh, my son is gay, my daughter is trans, I know this one person who's LGBTQ, or I'm LGBTQ or whatever. And when that happens, then, you know, you get a big hug, and that's super cool. But I really think that one of the lessons from 2016, and from that presidential campaign, is that the perception of authenticity, whether or not it is grounded in reality, is absolutely integral to politics in the modern day. In the modern campaign, people want to feel like they know who you are. While I would argue that the outgoing president of the United States is anything but authentic, I would certainly say that the perception of his authenticity is something where people will they will feel like they can trust him to be honest with how he feels about something. Whereas the way I look at it is, I will be actually authentic. I will actually put myself out there. I will actually tell you, you know, what my values are, and that there is no ambiguity about where I stand on the issues. I'm very blunt about that. And I knew that in order to unseat a 26-year incumbent who made his name off of, I say what I mean, and I mean what I say, the only way you were going to be able to go toe to toe with someone like that is to outdo him on it. And I really did. And you know, I got asked by reporters during my primary, especially, and then during the general, I said, well, if he's so problematic, how come he keeps winning? And I said, because he hasn't run against me yet. And some people might have thought I was like super conceited or whatever. They actually ran on TV making me out to be like super conceited. But the way I saw it was, no, I'm just assertive. I know what my strengths are. And at the same time, I really genuinely believe that when people know my platform, when they listen to my policies, that they see a level of depth and detail that is so often missing from American politics, where people are told to be vague, to be punchy, and to have these one sentence in and out, try to make people remember that sentence, and don't promise too much because you might not be able to get it done. Whereas for me, I said, no, this is what's going to, these are my policies. This is what's going to look like, how I'm going to pay for it, how I'm going to get it done, what it's going to result in. I gave this a litany of this is what my platform is that I typed myself. It's 2,400 word platform at 3 o'clock in the morning, because anxiety will do that for you when you're getting ready to run a campaign. And by putting all of that out there, I really thought people wanted to be able to believe in their politician and really be able to believe that there's a roadmap that they're following to get from A to B. And well, we not only did we do it in 2017, but I earned 12,077 votes that first election. And for my re-election last year, I earned 12,066 votes. So that's a 99.91% voter retention rate without the benefit of statewide turnout last year. So I like to think the people like what I'm doing. And now I'm going to find who those 11 voters are, by the way. We'll load them back next year.
Delegate Danica Rome out of Virginia, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Appreciate those that perspective and insight. So we're going to now transition from you to our roundtable session, including all of our panelists, all of our guests, including once again Maryland Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, also Pennsylvania State Representative Brian Sims, Representative Val Okamoto out of Hawaii, then Minnesota State Supreme Court Associate Justice Ann McKeag, and once again, Virginia Delegate Danica Rome, who you just heard a short time ago. So we're going to go ahead and open it up. You know what I am very curious about, and this question came to mind, everyone, and anyone can jump in here, while I was talking to Justice McKeag, and I wasn't aware of this with the Minnesota State Supreme Court, about how representative it was, how rich and textured it was in terms of its diversity, in terms of I never paid attention. I don't know state Supreme Court makeups as well as I'd like to, but you know, she was talking about how they're all kind of talking about and bringing their different backgrounds and perspectives to the table. Anyone can jump in on this. How do you sort of reconcile as legislators the tensions and the differences between those different diverse groups, you know, whether they be Black, Latino? Those tensions are there. That dynamic is always there. So there's that battle for representation and inclusion in a society that is defined many times by systemic racism and by, you know, white supremacy. But then there are also those tensions between different diverse demographic groups. How do we manage that? How do we reconcile that? Anybody can sort of jump in here on that.
I think that, you know, you have to, again, come to the table, right? I tell you, as a Black Latina, last year I had an incident that happened in Maryland where I belong to the Latino Caucus. I'm the vice chair of the caucus. I actually helped create it. And I am a member of the Black Caucus and have been a member of the Black Caucus for 14 years since I've been in the legislature. I'm a member of the Women's Caucus. But last year, there was a proposal from a Black Caucus member that you could not be a Black Caucus member if you belong to another caucus. Now, I want you to think about that, what that meant, because I am who I am. In front of you right now, I'm a woman of color. My culture is from Dominican Republic. My first language is Spanish. But my color, I do not get by laying at the beach. I get it from my history, from slavery. There was a time where we had more slaves in the islands than in the United States. So it's about educating and knowing the history, which I did with the Black Caucus. And needless to say, it was not a good moment. It was shameful. But we got in a room and we had a discussion like I'm having now, where I pour my heart out, where I told them how I felt, how offensive it was, and how could they ask me to get rid of the Blackness in me or the Latino in me when I'm all of it. So they got it. In that room, I'm not gonna tell you how it went and how there were tears and how we had to really have a discussion. But I think that people need to understand that today we are very mixed, especially in this country, and how we must respect each other's differences, each other's culture, and understand that at the end of the day, we share a lot of the same concerns, we share a lot of the same values and principles, and that we should try to get to an understanding of what we share, our experiences, that we may have our differences, but that we need to be respectful. And that together we're so much stronger, and I mean that. And that we can get so much done. But we must be willing to leave it all at the door and have an honest discussion where we peel that onion, we pour our heart, we share our experiences, and we try to compromise, but above all, respect each other's differences. And that at the end, we want the same things. We want a good house. We want to make a good living. We want to provide for our kids. We want a good environment. It is the same thing, no matter what you look like. But some of us have it easier than others.
Right.
And we have to admit that.
Thank you, Delegate. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in on that question before I bring the next question in there. Representative Okamoto?
I wanted to quickly, thank you. I love the passion again. You know, what I mentioned earlier about our state is, again, it makes it unique because actually the ethnic minorities here make up the majority of the people. So on the island of Oahu that I live on, there's 1 million people, and you know, you go further out, there's more people added on. But to me, that makes it just significant. Since I've been in office, I try to address issues with my daughters who are young. And one thing that's staggering to me is watching the news from Hawaii and watching what's happening, you know, in the continental states. And a lot of those issues, no, we're not perfect here by any means. There are issues here by far. But when it comes to things like inclusive and ethnicities, my kids, they don't see skin color, they see people, because we are mixed ourselves. They have a cousin who's part African-American and has, you know, has the Asian blood too. And when we send them to school, there aren't any dominant ethnicities because, again, we're such a melting pot here. Now, one thing that I'm very grateful for that, although I do want to make them aware that this is not the case in everywhere, every nation, every state here in our nation. And we do have issues with discrimination in other ways. But I think one thing I value here in Hawaii is that when we have these issues with race or minorities or any kind of disadvantage or different types of people, that we recognize that you can find, again, common grounds on everything. In Hawaii, actually, the Native Hawaiians, probably because of the history of the state and how we became part of the United States of America, they probably have still a lack of representation in our government. Sad to say that they're still not represented well. And ironically, a lot of the issues that we have in our state with homelessness and drugs addiction and mental health issues, a lot of it comes from the Native Hawaiian community because of generations of not having proper education or not having proper resources. So that's one thing that I'm passionate about, even though I don't have that ethnic blood. I'm from the islands. I have, again, my grandparents were of Native Hawaiian ancestry because my mom was adopted into that family. I wanted to quickly add, I appreciate Delegate Rome earlier mentioning her statistics of women in Hawaii. Out of 51 House members, we have just 15 that are female, about 29%. So about the same percentage as in Virginia. And that's also one thing that we still lack, the diversity there. I will say that last year I was in 2019, my first conference in Big Sky, Montana, was for CSG, and there was a workshop on women in government. And I could tell from the feedback that other states, they do struggle. I could tell the female participation, they struggle with how they're treated in their chambers or in their legislatures. I'm grateful that I don't feel that way, even though we are just a third of, you know, the chamber here. I'm grateful that it might be, again, due to the melting pot of our culture, that females are heard. We have a lot of chairs that are female, but still it would be nice to see, like was mentioned, I didn't initiate the run, I was asked to run. It would be nice to see more women to take that initiative because we are a minority here in our legislature. Thank you for letting me share.
Charles, really quickly, if I could, with respect to your question about intersectionality, and sort of the data bears this out, but it is certainly proven with Representative Okamoto and Delegate Pena-Melnick, and that is that in this modern world, in 2020, intersectionality is a superpower. It's an ability to speak to people that aren't always just like you, and an ability to reach across not just aisles, neighborhoods, and communities, and to talk to people that aren't just like you. You know, they say that people who have never had to overcome anything don't know how to overcome anything. And if the only thing that you know how to do is to speak to people that are just like you, that know your exact life experiences and no one else, I don't find that to be a particularly useful skill in any place, let alone in government. Delegate Rome and I have a close friend of mine named Rafi Friedman Gerspin. And Rafi was the last LGBT liaison to the White House. She was under Obama. And Rafi is an adopted Guatemalan transgender Jewish woman. And she's got this phenomenal rich history in all of these communities. And what she'll tell you is the same thing that I'm telling you. And that is that those abilities to see and reach across so many different types of identities is a massive strength in a world where we have been so segmented. All of those identities are worthy of celebration and identity, and they all come with really great heritage, but they allow people to talk.
I've visited a couple of times actually. So Representative Scott, thanks so much. And so first, she's making the statement, I believe we need to look at everybody, puts that in all caps, everybody as unique individuals, no matter what you look like or who you are. Would any of you be opposed to a white caucus in some of these states?
Yes.
There may be a Latino
Yes.
Black caucus. Got it. And the next part of that question, hold on one second. What advice would you give to white men who might be feeling reverse discrimination or white guilt, but still want to be relevant in discussions and not marginalized? Go ahead, Representative Sims.
Charles, white guilt is real, but white discrimination or reverse discrimination is not. There's no such thing as reverse discrimination. Discrimination is not about melanin necessarily. It's not about racial and ethnic identity. It's about power. And there has never been a power dynamic in this country or any others where white people are not in the majority, not in control of government and in business and finance, all areas. So reverse discrimination isn't real. Can somebody not like a white person because they are white? Yes, that's not racism though. And that might be discrimination, but it's not racism. More importantly, frankly, every legislature in the United States is a white caucus already. Now, could we talk about forming a white caucus so that white people could better learn from other white people about how to be anti-racist specifically? You know, sure, I want that. Of course, I want that. I'm sure every panelist on here wants that. But the concept of a white caucus is as ridiculous as white supremacy, as pretending that there's anything supreme about white people. And so, no, the questions are provocative, and I like a provocative question. But there's just simply no such thing as reverse racism. The last part of that is white guilt. How can you combat that? The most insidious thing about privilege is that it turns out people who have a particular privilege are more likely to have it successfully challenged by somebody who has that same privilege. Meaning that, you know, if you're a man if you're a sexist that is discounting the value of women's opinions, when a woman tells you about sexism and misogyny, you're already discounting that opinion. But you will listen to another man, unfortunately, and that's wrong. It's insidious, it is. But it does mean that it's incumbent upon men to combat sexism, not to just not be a sexist. It's incumbent upon white people to combat racism because that white racist is more likely to give their white opinion value. So make that opinion have value.
And if I may add to
Sure.
that, if I may, in Maryland, the only caucuses that are recognized by leadership are the Women Caucus, the Black Caucus, and Latino Caucus, and you have a Pacific Asian Caucus because it is defined as a group that represents the voice of the minority. Okay, and that is there is a distinction there where, you know, for example, in Maryland, out of 188, I'm only one of 4 Latinas. Okay, when our population in 2010, we were at least we were 9% of the population. Now in 2020, we're more than that. Could you imagine not being at that table, your views not being considered? And
Actually, I appreciate the responses, and thank you, Representative Scott.
May I add one quick thing?
Delegate Rome?
Great, thank you very kindly. So One of the things I would point out is that here in Virginia, in the 401-year history of the Virginia House of Delegates, straight white men held a supermajority of the House of Delegates for 399 years. Really let that set in for a second. One demographic group, and a very specific demographic group of that, cisgender, heterosexual, white men, held a supermajority, more than 2/3 of the legislature, for 399 years, 4 centuries. And even now, there's still an overwhelming majority. The Republican caucus in the House of Delegates has 45 members. 44 of them are white. The other one is Cuban American. And when you break down that number, the reason we have caucuses, just as you were just hearing about, the reason we have caucuses in the first place is to give strength in numbers to people who are in a minority group. This is the difference between when you are, let's say, for example, you're in Ryan Sims area in Philadelphia, where you have a lot of, public demonstration, you have a lot of people who celebrate different groups, different ethnicities. You might have Puerto Rican Day Parade, for example. You might have a Dominican parade. But then, like me, I'm an Italian woman. So we have Italian heritage festivals, right? And that's great. And no one is accusing people of, racism for celebrating Italian heritage or something, right? We do that because that in and of itself is a smaller subset of a larger group. That said, if you were to then say, we're going to have a white heritage thing, then that's taking people who have had the entire power structure that Representative Sims was talking about and giving them a platform beyond the platform that they already have that is a majority view, more or less. And the issue that we need to have is that when we are talking about states that, like Idaho, are less diverse, for example, but at the same time have a growing population, and you might have a lot of people who have uneasy feelings about whether it's change or whether they might feel that they're not represented, it is also incumbent upon those people to then go directly to their legislators and ask, what are you doing that is out of step with your viewpoint as a constituent and when you're feeling underrepresented? Because in the Idaho House of Representatives, as I know the representative is well aware, white men have a supermajority control. And so this is an issue that I think goes beyond state lines, and it goes beyond talking about it in terms of whiteness at that point. And it should be getting to a point of, do you have your voice being heard as a demographic group or any group that has a collective issue or collective set of issues that are different from what the majority experiences? I'm one of 5 LGBTQ legislators in Virginia. So that's 135 of my colleagues do not fall into that category. That's why we have our own little group. You know what I mean?
Thank you, Delegate. No, that's I appreciate that. Representative Okimoto, I think you would wanted to kind of weigh in. I'd be curious to get your perspective on that too, from a state like Hawaii, because you were just talking a few moments ago about how multi-ethnic, how much of a melting pot Hawaii is, how mixed it is, and so which is a lot of people don't tend to forget or don't realize.
As I was sitting here, I find it fascinating because, again, this is just my second term in office, and we do have caucuses here, but I'm hearing about the caucuses elsewhere and how there's the Black, the Native, the Latino, and here in Hawaii, we don't have that. We do have a Native Hawaiian caucus, and that's because the Hawaii people are indigenous, and they come with, again, generations of the issues that we need to address for the Native Hawaiian indigenous people. But other than that, there aren't any other ethnic caucuses. We do have one for the women. We have a keiki caucus. The keiki are the kids again. We have a kupuna caucus, and these are issue related. So I find it fascinating that from my perspective, our caucuses are built around the issues of our state, how we can make sure that we're caring for our elderly, making sure that our kids are taken care of, making sure that our small businesses are taken care of. It is very different. Other than the Native Hawaiian caucus, we don't have these ethnic caucuses. And I think it's fascinating that other states do. I'm learning so much. I appreciate you sharing. Again, I guess I go back to that, what I've been sharing earlier. I think if we go back to maybe focusing on those issues versus ethnicity or race, because you can find issues across gender, across ethnicities, and base it and focus on that versus, I'm speaking again because in Hawaii, we have so many cultures that are melted into one that there's no dominant. If anything, the white Caucasians are not the popular ones here, ironically. And, we have, again, multi-ethnic generations of multi-ethnic cultures here. I have multi-ethnic.
And it's fascinating too to watch as well, how these conversations have evolved over time. And I'm speaking as someone who's Gen X and biracial, half Black, half white, and, born at a time where in certain states it was against the law for someone like me to be born. And to have seen that evolution and growing up in a city like Philadelphia, you can speak to this, obviously, Representative Sims, that was a very interesting, fascinating, and very, and this is to say the least, very, at times, very treacherous journey, right? So, but now it's just so fascinating and wonderful on a lot of levels to see this conversation and have these kinds of panels. I just didn't see it growing up as a young person, as a child. I do want to, Justice McKeag, if you can jump in on this question, and then others can expound on this, about how states can make the kinds of structural modifications they need to ensure increased access and inclusion. What are some of the strategies? And Justice, I'd like to hear from you, give you some time to weigh in on this discussion. What are some strategies that states can use to ensure inclusion in policymaking? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that it was fascinating listening to this, and I'm just watching it going back and forth, and I'm like, yeah, we don't have these conversations necessarily in the judiciary. We have them in a different way, but yeah, for the judiciary, it is a little bit different because we have been struggling with this, and of course, then the pandemic hit, which is really, I think, even accentuated the disparities across the country and how it impacts people specifically as it's relating to access to justice in our court system. Because I'll give you some examples just here in the state of Minnesota. We have 11 reservations, and some of those reservations are in very rural parts of our state. Well, those parts of our state are not very well equipped with access to internet and Wi-Fi. And yet, we have all of our kids who are trying to do their education now virtually. And the reservations don't have necessarily the equipment to be handing out to kids on the reservation to be able to participate in school. So we've had that issue. We've had issue with non-English speaking people being able to understand what's going on in court proceedings. The cost of interpreters. We've had a huge explosion of individuals who are self-represented and then trying to understand the complexities of court proceedings that are moving at a very rapid pace because you're trying to get through these calendars. We've got judges who are trying to do 100-line calendars within a 3-hour time frame because they've got an afternoon of another 100 cases that they've got to get through. And so how do you manage that to ensure that you are actually addressing the individual's needs rather than just the masses' needs? And so some things have developed that have been exciting. So for example, in Minnesota, one of the requests, we did some listening sessions where we went out into the community, the Native community, and we held a feast and we gathered the elders as well as others. And we said, tell us what you'd like to see differently. And one of the things was that in the Indian community, we use sage or we use sweetgrass and as a cleansing, and we'll use it to smudge and to wash over ourselves. Wow. To put us in a good way. And they said, we'd like to be able to do that when we're coming to court because it's a very anxious time. And when we're leaving court. And of course, if you can imagine bureaucracy, how do you get the ability to have smoke that's going to be in 9 government buildings? Well, we did it. And we were able to then go back to the community at our second hosting and say, you asked for this, we now have it in all 9 of our government buildings.
Wow.
And here's how you can do it. And we have the materials available. We also have now the 11 tribes have done flag presentations. And so the flags are actually hung behind some of the benches in our court buildings, so that when someone like myself comes to court, they see the 11 reservation, the tribal flags are hung right next to the United States flag and the flag of Minnesota.
Wow.
And so it's just those little things have made a huge difference. And some things like that don't have to cost a lot of money. The greetings in our government center, you know, putting that in Ojibwe, putting it in Dakota, putting it in Spanish, Hmong, all Somali, all of our major languages, so that when people come there, they see that on the board and feel at least that they are represented there.
Let me ask you real quick, and Justice McKay, thank you for that too. That's very inspiring to hear that. And I'm going to do a little lightning round here too, because we're about to wrap up soon. So I'm going to go around the table, give you all about maybe a minute each, and talk about the benefits. So you hear like what the justice just described, and I know that that's happening in other states. There's the symbolism and the substance, but just how meaningful it is to have that kind of diversity and inclusion. But the benefits of ensuring that everyone's at the table, is seated at the table. What are those benefits, Delegate? I'll start with you. I'll give you a minute each.
Sure. Could you repeat and I'm sorry, which delegate did you want to speak?
You know what? Well, I'll start with you, Delegate Rome. Yeah, and now you've heard this whole conversation, the overall benefits of having all groups at the table.
The overall benefits of having all groups at the table is that you're not missing a worldview that's not represented, and you have different people who come from different experiences instead of just getting into a cacophony of an echo chamber where you're just hearing, someone who has similar lived experiences to yours, even if it's not the same story as yours, growing up in the same community, having, the same privilege or lack thereof, whatever it is. Whereas when you have more diverse views at the table, you may be open to ideas that you have not considered before because you've never heard someone speak about that within your own community. And so at a panel like this, if I'm able to speak to someone who is Afro-Latino in one state next door to mine, if I'm able to speak to someone who comes from the most diverse legislature in America in Hawaii, if I'm able to speak to someone, dear friend of mine, and Brian Sims from a couple of the states over, who also has a very different perspective than mine, and I'm not just talking about him as a gay man, me as a trans woman, but here he lives in a big city. I represent the suburbs. And then to hear a Native voice on the judiciary, which is widely underrepresented, you're going to have a lot of different stories, a lot of different perspectives, which then means a lot of different issues being brought to the table.
Thanks, Delegate. Delegate Pena Melnick, just real quick on the benefits, right? And I mean, really, inclusion is the total benefit. I mean, it makes policy better.
Not only does it, and thank you for the question, and thank you for moderating, and for everyone here. I feel so inspired. Look, I really think that the benefits are that it's really the humane thing to do to begin with, to be fair, to be thoughtful, to be inclusive of everyone, because when we pass a bill, in Maryland, we have 6 million people, and we're all so different. It affects all of us. And I think that it gives you perspective to have different people at the table. You basically are more creative. You have more innovation. You help the morale. Given respect, to be inclusive, and you get compliance. When you want, especially in public health, when you want a certain policy, you want people to feel included and respected. They'll agree with it, and they'll try to, be respectful of that policy. I really think you can't go wrong. It's an asset.
You can't. Thank you, Delegate. Representative Sims, real quick.
Charles, thank you. Thank you for the question. And again, thank you also for hosting. It matters because aside from being the sort of morally ethically appropriate thing to do, to create and manage and grow diverse spaces. It matters, especially in government, because if the purpose of government is to maximize the gains for all of us and to minimize the losses for as many of us as possible, diversity in government is proven to do that. Bringing forth, as you heard from Delegate Rome, bringing forth the opinions, the life experiences, the shared and the lived experiences of people who have not been represented in environments where they get to make decisions about others means that those decisions about others will help problem solve, they'll help minimize difficulties, they'll help maximize the gains for those people. It's not just the moral and ethical thing to do, it's the thing that we can do to most maximize the function of government.
That's right. Representative Okamoto.
Thank you. You know, I love what Delegate Rome said about the echo chamber. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in that. In Hawaii, prior to this year, we had probably the worst voting turnout in the state, in our country. The state has the lowest, and people have lost faith here in their elected officials. For me, having everybody come to the table brings government back to the people. It restores faith in who they have put into office, and that's who I am. I tell people, hold me accountable. Come and talk to me. It gives the people a voice. And that's something I'm very passionate about, bringing government back into the communities. It's not so much about what's happening up here and special interest groups and lobbyists. That's all important, but government should be brought back to the people. I think because here people have lost faith in government. I can't tell you how many people I run into in my district that say, I just don't vote because it doesn't matter. Nobody listens. It breaks my heart because I'm standing there saying, I will listen. I will be your voice. And I have people on from every avenue of life that have come to me and have supported me because I listen. And I think that's valuable when you want to bring diversity to the table. I played sports growing up. I think when there's competition and opposition, it instills growth, and that change is important. If you have the same thing, you're not going to grow. And so for me, having that diversity is what challenges us. It holds us accountable, but it lets us grow as well.
Yeah, it's kind of borrowing off of Representative Sims. Inclusion is a superpower. Justice McKeag, I'll give you about 30 seconds before I pass it on to.
All I'm going to say is that we have to remember that the diversity is important for those that what we do impacts. It's one thing to look at a law when you're writing it, and it's another thing for us to be looking at our decisions, but it makes a difference for those who are actually feeling the effects of what we do every day. And if we don't hear from them, then we might be really missing the boat completely.
Thank you. This is a wonderful discussion. You all gave me some food for thought, and I may be calling you too to join me for some more discussions on this. In fact, we had Dr. Peter Frank out of New Jersey who's saying this community of diverse government leaders is incredible. I do hope the group can gather more frequently beyond the conference. Thank you, Dr. Frank, really appreciate that. So that ends our session. Well, it doesn't end our session. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic over to Dina Klemenka, and definitely I want to send my appreciation, my thanks, my gratitude to the Conference of State Governments or Council of State Governments team. Thank you so much for including me in this discussion. Thank you all, public servants, for participating with us as well and sharing your perspectives. Wonderful insights, really appreciate it. Dina, back to you.
Thank you, Charles. I am energized and inspired and excited. So thank you to our amazing speakers, and thank you to our fantastic moderator. And we really appreciate your time and dedication and your service to your community. Thank you. And I want to also thank our partners at CSG East and the Council on Communities of Color, and everybody who attended and participated today. We really appreciate you taking the time to engage in such a meaningful and important discussion. And we really hope that we can have more of these discussions moving towards the future. We ask that you do take a moment to fill out a survey you received following this webinar, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this session and find opportunities to connect with you in your state and do more fantastic work like this. To learn more about our efforts in equity and inclusion or disability employment policy, or connect with any of these speakers today, please contact us. My email's on the screen at dklemkina@csg.org. Next slide. I also want to encourage everybody to attend our upcoming sessions. So tomorrow we will have a session on telework, which will be largely focused on telework as well as disability. Then we will have a meeting on the Council of Communities of Color, and then what the election means for states as we wrap up our national conference this year. Next slide. And thank you again for attending, and thank you to all of the CSG National Conference Reimagine sponsors. And with that, I hope you have a fantastic afternoon. Next slide. And thank you all so much. Have a great day.